did you have any concerns that there was a rise in the mortality rate?
Yes.
Okay, so tell me about that. What concerns did you have?
I think we don't just notice as a team in general, the nursing staff that
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't hear. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear the thoughts build up until I can't hear. That my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. What is the source of Lucy's sadism? Well, what is sadism? Sadism is the opposite of altruism. Instead of cruelty, there is sympathy and compassion. Well, so in terms of sadism, instead of sympathy and compassion, in the neonatal ward, there is cruelty from one particular nurse, Lucy Letby. The question is why and where does it come from? And there's a really compelling article that actually describes the incredible pain some of these little children, these little babies went through. Normally they don't make a noise at all, and some of them scream for 30 minutes, and it just shows you that they went through a lot of pain, and whoever put them into that pain knew they were experiencing pain and did it again and again and again and again and again. That is sadism. Now, so if you ask the question, what is the source of Lucy's sadism? Some of it, I believe, is nature. Lucy seems to have an introverted personality. What Lucy shares with Rex Huerman, and I've just put a second one on YouTube. Please watch that if you haven't. You've also just heard Lucy's voice at the beginning of this clip. You can hear that she's quite soft-spoken. She's quite shy. She's quite reserved. And now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, I'm shy, I'm soft-spoken, I'm not a serial killer. I must say, this is kindergarten level sort of thing where you say, but this isn't about you. We're trying to find out about Lucy Letby. Is it okay if we do that? If we say that she's wearing pink shoes and you say, well, I'm wearing pink shoes, it's not about you. Are you able to look past yourself to another person? Because that is what is required when you try and walk in the shoes of another person. And that is what we're going to try and do here. So, and it's also not to say that the introversion is the full and final explanation. It's a key, right? And in my opinion, it's quite a good key. Now, it's not me saying that she's soft-spoken or even that she's surprisingly soft-spoken. Even her friends have said that she's shy and reserved. According to some experts, roughly a quarter of the population is introverted. Very few people are 100% introverted. So if you're an introvert, the issue is also, are you as introverted as Lucy is? Are you as soft-spoken as she is? Are you as introverted as what she is? And maybe the answer is yes, but then the next question is, do you work in an area that suits your personality? And whatever the answer is, great. Well, what about Lucy? Do you think working in a neonatal ward, which is high stress, lots of noise, lots of frenzied activity, do you think that is the right environment for someone like Lucy? Another part of who Lucy is and also who we are is nurture. I suspect that she inherits much of her anxiety from her parents. Her parents foster, it seems to me, emotional dependence and thus anxiety. But Lucy makes everything worse by taking something that is already all about details and being anal about it. Why is it that Lucy likes working, often volunteering for night shifts? Why does she seem to conduct an affair while at work? All of this is aggravating an already difficult situation. Being a neonatal nurse working night shifts is already a very dislocating experience, working at night. It doesn't matter where you work. If you work at night, and I can tell you I've worked a lot of night shifts, as a YouTuber, as a writer. It's extremely isolating, right? And so to volunteer to do that is going to be incredibly isolating. And so why is someone who apparently can't deal with her own emotions putting herself in an emotionally taxing environment like a neonatal unit? The short answer is that she's trying to become the hero of her own story, and when she finds that she can't, she resorts to sadism. If we're going to talk about sadism, then we must introduce something else, something that's a byproduct in a sense of anxiety, and that's anality. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Welcome to the thousands of you who have subscribed. I must tell you that the area we're going into now is quite complicated, quite difficult. It's kind of an where angels fear to tread area. And so this is really where you want to put on your thinking caps and concentrate. Obviously, if you're going to make this all about yourself and put yourself, in other words, put this analysis first through the prism of yourself, well, then you're going to be pretty unhappy. What we need to do is see how this resonates with what we know about Lucy and see if we can figure that part out. If we can figure that part out about somebody else, then maybe we've got a chance of doing the same about ourselves. If you're enjoying this episode, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So how we're going to structure this analysis is we're going to answer the question straight off the bat. In other words, where does the sadism come from? We're going to answer the question without rolling out the red carpet, without setting it up or putting out any context. Then B, we're going to deal with how the theory connects to Lucy Letby, try and make it a bit more relevant. And then C, we're going to address the concept generally in an accessible way. And that's your opportunity to just say, how can I make this about me, right? When we get to that third level, you can think about it, how it reflects on yourself. And then we come to D, which is where we're going to run through the whole thing a second time just to get a deeper familiarity regarding it. We just want some additional insight and explanation during the second run through. In other words, we're going to deal with this from an outside-in approach rather than the system I preferred, which is inside-out. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. A, the source of Lucy's sadism is her anality, which in turn comes from anxiety. Briefly put, the source of Lucy's sadism is anxiety. Confused? Good. Let's move on to the next level. B, make no mistake, when someone commits murder, just even a single murder, they are engaging in sadistic behavior. To kill another human being is callous, cold-blooded, and cruel. To do so 7 times is vicious and merciless, and indicates a very high degree of sadism. The judge in this case has hinted at the same thing, saying that Lucy had displayed malevolence bordering on sadism, following a cruel, calculated, and cynical campaign of child murder. I don't know if I would say it's bordering on sadism. I think if you know how those children were crying, and how unusual it is for them to be crying, and you knew that they were in pain, it definitely is sadistic. So where does Lucy's sadism come from? Even when we know from her best friend, Dawn Howe, that Lucy's the most kind, gentle, soft friend. Lucy's the kindest person I've ever known. It is the most out-of-character accusation that you could ever put against Lucy. Well, if we can't find any anality, then Dawn may have a case. In other words, if that's absent, then maybe Lucy is innocent. So what do you think? Do you think we will find anality in Lucy's background, in her upbringing, in her personality, in the type of work she chose to do? Let me just say, any person who turns themselves inside out to appear nice, someone who spends a lot of their effort trying to come across as a nice person, that is an anal person in and of itself, because they are not being themselves. And behind that nice exterior is often a lot of anxiety and a lot of fear and a lot of other issues. And that's why one needs to put up that mask. Now, if you're scratching your head because you're still not sure what anality actually means, good. Let's go on to the next level. C, all of us are anal in different ways, and all of us have a certain degree of sadism wired into us. Let me say that again. All of us are also, to some extent, sadistic. And it's important to understand that there's a continuum between the two. So where you have anality, you have sadism. Where you have sadism, you have anality. The more anal you are, the more sadistic you're capable of being. The more sadistic your behavior, the more anal your backstory, whatever it is. Equally, the less anal you are, the less sadistic you are. Unfortunately, as we know in the Matrix, no one can be simply told what this psychological matrix is. You have to see it for yourself to know what we're talking about. And without intuiting it, well then it's just a shallow intellectual conversation with no insight. As you probably noticed, many of these concepts are quite simple to express, but they're a lot more difficult to understand at face value. So let's go through the process once again, but we'll go down a little deeper with more detail this time. So let's start at A. Lucy's anality admittedly is something of a mystery. Without meeting her or seeing her speak, seeing her testify, it's difficult to be confident on this issue. Without seeing her testify, as I say, it's also tough to get a handle on her. And obviously there were some journalists who did see her, and then they did say what they observed. Of course, we have been offered a glimpse of Lucy speaking to the cops on the 3rd of July 2018. You heard that right at the beginning of this episode. So we do have a little bit of a glimpse there of the kind of person that she is. And we do know some of the substance of her testimony. We also know that she hasn't simply denied committing crimes, but blamed others around her, which is hardly innocent. Let me say that again. She didn't simply say, I didn't do it. She's passed the blame, passed the buck to others around her. And that is not an innocent way to respond to that. Now, based on this limited window into her interior life, I've got a few theories. So basically 3 subheadings to this idea of Lucy's anality. And it's a psychological thing, right? It's a psychological anality. And so at this point, you don't need to know what it is, although we're going to define that before the end of this episode. What I want to make sure I convey is what it feels like, what this anality feels like. Okay, so let's start, and this is in terms of Lucy. Let's start with anality in relationships. So having an affair with a married staff member, which I believe did happen, also is hardly behavior that doesn't harm others. So yes, there's even a degree of sexual sadism in adultery. One derives pleasure while hurting others. And we know that Lucy was literally reading a book about this, Never Greener, at the time of her arrest. Adultery also has anality in it in terms of the secret nature of the affair, and also the often obsessive compulsive aspect that's associated with these sorts of relationships. In other words, it's not loving someone in a free, open, transparent, spontaneous, healthy way, but rather in a desperate, twisted way, meanwhile compartmentalizing the experience so that others don't catch on. Now let's deal with anality in terms of work. Being a neonatal nurse on night shift, caring for perhaps half a dozen or more at any one time. Does anyone know the exact number here? All I know is that they were dealing with more infants than I believe they were supposed to, that they were sort of understaffed. And so that has got to be not only stressful but frustrating. Not only frustrating but emotionally demanding. Not only emotionally demanding but demoralizing. I mean, think about it in practice. Imagine looking after one other person's baby. Now make it 2. Now make it 3. Now these babies aren't necessarily healthy. And you've got to do all of this at night. Night after night after night. And sometimes alone at night. And that's something that I don't really understand. Some people have said, you are not understanding the shift schedule. But it's a absolute fact that many of these crimes occurred when Lucy was alone on duty. And that doesn't mean she was alone on the hospital or the only person in the city. It means that she was the only nurse in that sort of space. That's what we're talking about. And if you don't acknowledge that, then I think it's quite hard to acknowledge how depressing it must be in that situation, where the substance of one's work, particularly when dealing with sickly babies, is a fast-paced frenzy of constant screaming as well as endless flows of urine, excrement, snot and mucus. And a lot of this is playing out at night. Personally, I think it's tough to imagine anything worse, anything more unpleasant as one's full-time job. That's just my opinion. A neonatal nurse must also be highly detail-oriented, knowing about feeding, sleeping, and medication schedules for each of the infants in their care, as well as being able to do medical duties on tiny people with care and precision. According to Indeed.com, quote, this can include inserting and managing intravenous lines, administering tube feedings, assisting with intubation or ventilation, performing blood draws, and conducting tests or screenings. Besides the everyday substance of the role, the job itself is, as I've been trying to emphasize, socially isolating and often involves constant sleep deprivation. Number 3, anality within upbringing, or put in another way, anality from parents. If Lucy grew up in a coddled, cloistered, controlled cocoon created by her parents, then she would be particularly unprepared for the emotionally demanding role of a neonatal nurse. Also, if she was naturally withdrawn and introverted, she would have difficulty not being overwhelmed with the requirements of her role, which includes excellent communication skills, not only with parents, but also with doctors. I think if you don't like the word introvert, like if you feel like I'm an introvert and this serial killer, you're calling her an introvert, I feel insulted by that. Perhaps a better word then is withdrawn. That we're dealing with a withdrawn person or someone who's often withdrawn to such an extent that she goes on holiday with her parents. She's often with her parents, and her parents are by her side when there's a work conflict, right? And then this person is actually required to communicate in this very cacophonic environment, not only with doctors but also with parents. Those post-it notes, whether real or contrived, indicate Lucy likely struggled to express herself. So let me ask you, in your opinion, from this cursory glossing through of Lucy's personal work and home life, do you get any sense of anality? So now I want to properly lift the veil of this psychological thing that is anality. You know, chances are, if you're unfamiliar with this channel or with my books, you might be hearing it for the first time. Now, imagine a small child who learns that instead of controlling his bladder, in other words, himself, as a way to gain love and acceptance, instead learns that by not controlling himself, by playing with or throwing around his feces, he can control others. Anality is a little like that. Imagine an architect, instead of looking up at the sky and producing inspired, creative designs, but nevertheless disciplined, they're realistic, designs that make sense and lead to success, trying to build a reputation. Instead, he focuses on burrowing through books for the rules and minutiae, the codes of conduct that prevent buildings from being built. Anality isn't one size fits all. So one person may experience what one person experiences as anal, stressful, or unbearable, someone else might actually enjoy. I'll use myself as an example. During my 40s, I wrote a lot, so much I ended up writing over 100 books. That process, typing, writing, editing, formatting, is extremely anal when you're doing it all the time. Sometimes it was effortless, while at other times, especially when wrapping up the final chapters of a book, it felt overwhelming, almost like a living death. But to someone else, you might think, writing seems like harmless fun. Addictions are also anal. To you, your addictions and compulsions may be fun and enjoyable, but to the person next to you, they may suck the joy out of living and be like a killjoy. Some parental styles are anal. You might disagree with my or someone else's definition of what's anal, but the issue is how this manifests. If it manifests in some form of sadism, then it is anal no matter what you think, and it isn't healthy. Anality can also manifest as being OCD about being clean, or being on time, or simply controlling others around you. I know what you're thinking. How does all this cerebral stuff tie into me or to Lucy? Well, the key here is anxiety. To the extent that you cannot deal with real life in realistic terms, your anxiety increases and you end up withdrawing into anality. You end up playing with feces, effectively. And this blocking, limiting, suppressing, and repressing of the life force leads to increased feelings of resentment, feelings of insufficiency and insignificance. Because, of course, the only way to figure out the real world is to be in the real world. The only way to gain agency for yourself is to put yourself in the real world and test yourself. And I think it's very interesting that Lucy was at that age, early 20s, when what she was required to do was become an adult, was individuate. And what is she doing? She's in this situation surrounded by babies, surrounded by other families that are becoming families. And I think the question was starting to loom larger and larger. What about you? Are you going to have a family? Are you capable of having a family? I think the final dimension for this, which is both really full of epiphanies and very insightful, but also some of the most complicated stuff to understand, especially if it's your first run through. It's from the Pulitzer Prize winning writer Ernest Becker, and what he says about anality and being anal retentive. He's got a far more elegant explanation of this than I do. He says, he describes the anal person as depersonalized, alienating, someone who in a way arises as a result of the conditions of a bureaucratic industrial society. And I can't really think of a situation that is more bureaucratic and, all sorts of paperwork than a neonatal unit that is, affiliated with the NHS. Anyway, he goes on to say he loves order, routine, mechanical things, and he fears openness, spontaneity, and living things. So he prefers things to persons, order over freedom, and ultimately death over life. The pathology of his perception is to see beauty in that which is frozen and not fluid, that which is possessed and controlled, rather than that which is free and surprising, and above all, to worship those who use force, coercion, and destruction to impose an iron pattern on life and reality. Now, I don't think it's any surprise that Lucy experiences this crisis in the middle of her attempt to individuate from her own parents. It's because she's already extremely anxious that her efforts fail. Going back to Becker, he describes a feeling of being blocked, limited, transcended, without knowing why. He describes the peculiar experience of an organism which can apprehend a totality of things but not be able to move in relation to it. He describes man experiencing this uniquely as a feeling of the crushing awesomeness of things and his helplessness in the face of them. And many of us feel these same feelings. The question is, how do we respond to it? In Becker's book, The Denial of Death, on page 171, he refers to the creative solution. He says, it takes a strength and courage the average man doesn't have and couldn't even understand to separate ourselves from everybody else. And so what one's got to do is create a framework of heroic self-reference. Well, what is that? On page 178, Becker refers to the efforts people go to protect themselves against the world. And he can only do this by narrowing down the world, shutting down experiences, developing an obliviousness both to the terrors of the world and to their own anxieties. And so the question is this an explanation for Lucy and for what she did? So here's my opinion. This makes me suspect that Lucy may have killed certain babies for several reasons. Perhaps one was to gain control of her environment, right? If things were getting out of hand, there were too many babies and she was feeling overwhelmed, it was one way of whittling down that situation. Another perhaps was to govern in the sense of voyeuristically lording over the death of a child. And this is more a psychological response, to initiate this process where the baby collapses and dies, and then to view the emotional response to that in a strange way, perhaps in a sadistic way, luxuriating in the grief, luxuriating in the drama, perhaps enjoying the crisis she had created, enjoying it because it gives her a sense of agency that she made all of this happen. And she's important because she lies at the center of it. And she's the one who knows more than anyone else does because it's a situation of her own creation. And yet another application was how it could push the buttons of certain doctors she liked, forcing them to engage with her, and apparently she did this successfully. If you think maladaptive anxiety is something unique to serial killers and murderers, think again. Because all of us are going to die one day, that is a reality we all have to face, or avoid, or escape with varying degrees of success. But that is a reality whether we deal with it or not. And whether we deal with the reality of our own deaths with equanimity or not, anxiety is absolutely part of our deal on earth. Look, in a very real sense, life itself seems to have a cruel and sadistic sense of humor. The fact that we're born and we are, fated to die doesn't seem fair. It seems pretty cruel and sadistic. We didn't sign up for this. But we can either accept that or deny it. But whatever we do and however we do it, there are very real, often life-altering consequences to our psychological choices. Once again, what I'm trying to show you is that anxiety in certain people can be sort of out of control, and people might twist themselves into knots trying to control this inner anxiety, right? Whereas some other people may simply just avoid thinking about it. The point is, no matter who you are, this anxiety is real, and it can translate into varying degrees of anality and sadism. To the extent that it does, can mean that it becomes criminal psychology. To the extent that it doesn't, well, you found a way to deal with your anxiety in a somewhat constructive way. It means you're not in complete denial about your existence. I'm going to close off with a quote from Ernest Becker, The Denial of Death. It's read out by Gabriel Byrne from the documentary Flight from Death, The Quest for Immortality. I'll put a link to the trailer in the description.
To have emerged from nothing, to have a name, consciousness of self, deep inner feelings, an excruciating inner yearning for life and self-expression. And with all this, yet to die.